In the winter of 1847, deep in the Rocky Mountains where civilization was nothing more than a distant memory, there lived a man who had turned his back on the world of men. His name was Ezekiel Thornton, though few remained who remembered it. To the occasional trapper or trader who crossed his path, he was simply known as the Mountain Man, a towering figure with a wild mane of dark hair and a beard that fell to his chest, dressed in furs and leather that had long ago become one with the wilderness itself. Ezekiel had built his cabin in a valley so remote that even the native tribes rarely ventured there. It was a place of profound silence, broken only by the howl of wolves and the whisper of wind through ancient pines. He had come here 15 years ago, after losing his wife and infant daughter to fever back in Missouri. The grief had hollowed him out, leaving behind only the shell of a man who wanted nothing more than to disappear into the wild places where memory couldn't follow. On this particular evening, as darkness crept across the snow-covered landscape and the temperature plummeted to bone-breaking cold, Ezekiel was splitting wood outside his cabin when he heard something unusual. A sound that didn't belong to the wilderness. It was faint, almost swallowed by the wind, but unmistakable to his trained ears. Crying. Children's voices, weak and desperate. He stood motionless, his axe held still in mid-swing, listening. The sound came again, drifting from the north where the forest grew thick. Every instinct told him to ignore it, to retreat into his cabin and bar the door against whatever troubles the world was trying to thrust upon him. He had survived out here precisely because he had learned to mind his own business, to let the mountain take what it would without interference. But the crying continued, and with it came another sound, a woman's voice, hoarse and pleading, calling out words he couldn't quite make out. Ezekiel cursed under his breath, a long string of profanity that would have scandalized the church-going folk he'd left behind. He set down his axe, went inside to grab his rifle and a lantern, and headed into the darkening forest. The snow was deep, reaching past his knees in places, but Ezekiel moved through it with the ease of long practice. He followed the sounds, which grew louder as he approached. Definitely children, more than one, and they sounded terrified. His lantern cast wild shadows through the trees as he pushed forward, and then he saw them. A woman lay collapsed in the snow, her dress torn and bloodied, her face pale as death itself. Huddled around her were 3 small children, identical in appearance. Triplets, he realized with shock, none of them older than 5 or 6 years. They were inadequately dressed for the weather, their thin coats offering little protection against the deadly cold. All 3 had the same blonde hair, the same blue eyes wide with terror, and the same hollow-cheeked look of advanced starvation. As Ezekiel's lantern light fell upon them, the children shrank back against their mother's still form. One of them, a little boy who seemed to be trying to shield his siblings, looked up at the massive fur-clad figure approaching them and his voice cracked with pure terror as he whispered, "Don't kill us. Please, mister, don't kill us." The words struck Ezekiel like a physical blow. What had these children seen? What horrors had they endured that would make them look at a potential rescuer with such abject fear? He slowly lowered his rifle and raised his free hand in what he hoped was a reassuring gesture. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. He rarely spoke anymore, and the words felt strange in his mouth. "Your mama. Is she alive?" The woman stirred slightly at his voice, her eyelids fluttering. Ezekiel could see now that her leg was badly injured, the bone possibly broken, and she had lost a significant amount of blood. How she had made it this far with 3 small children was beyond comprehension. It must have been sheer maternal will that kept her moving. "We're lost," the little boy said, his voice trembling. "Mama said. She said someone would help us." "But the men, the bad men." He didn't finish, but Ezekiel understood. Outlaws, most likely, or deserters from one of the military expeditions. The frontier was full of predators, both animal and human. These people had clearly been running from something terrible. "How long you been out here?" Ezekiel asked, kneeling down slowly so as not to frighten them further. "Days," one of the girls whispered. "We had food, but it's gone. Mama can't walk anymore." Ezekiel assessed the situation with the practical eye of a man who had survived countless harsh winters. The woman needed immediate medical attention, crude as it might be, and all 4 of them were suffering from hypothermia and starvation. If he left them here, they would be dead by morning. Even if he wanted to harden his heart against them, which he found surprisingly difficult, The simple logistics were clear. He was their only chance. "I got a cabin not far from here," he said. "Got food, fire, medicine. But we gotta move quick. Can you yanguns walk?" The three children looked at each other, then at their unconscious mother, then back at this terrifying stranger with his wild appearance and rough voice. Finally, the boy nodded. "We can walk. But what about Mama?" "I'll carry her," Ezekiel said. He looked at the boy, who seemed to be the designated leader of the trio. "What is your name, son?" "Thomas, the boy said. This is my sisters, Mary and Elizabeth." "All right, Thomas. I'm gonna need you to be brave now. I need you to help your sisters follow me. Can you do that?" Thomas straightened his thin shoulders and nodded with a solemnity far beyond his years. Ezekiel gently lifted the woman. She weighed almost nothing, he noticed with concern, and positioned her across his shoulders. With his rifle in one hand and the lantern in the other, he began the trek back to his cabin, the three children struggling through the snow behind him. It was slow going. The children were exhausted and weak, frequently stumbling. Ezekiel had to stop often to let them catch up, fighting his impatience even as he worried about the woman's deteriorating condition. Mary, one of the twins, fell face-first into a snowdrift and simply lay there, too tired to get up. Ezekiel had to set down the mother, pull Mary out, and carry both of them for the last quarter mile. When they finally reached the cabin, it was full dark and the temperature had dropped even further. Ezekiel kicked open the door and carried the woman inside, laying her as gently as he could on his own bed. The children stumbled in after him, staring around at the rough interior with wide eyes. The single room with its stone fireplace, the basic furniture he'd built himself, the animal hides on the walls, the supplies stacked neatly in one corner. "Thomas," Ezekiel barked, falling easily into a command voice he hadn't used in years. "Get your sisters close to the fire." "Not too close. You'll burn." "Just close enough to get warm." "Don't touch nothing." While the children huddled by the fireplace, Ezekiel turned his attention to the mother. Her pulse was weak and thready. Her leg was definitely broken, and the wound had become infected. He had seen men die from less. Working quickly, he built up the fire, put water on to boil, and gathered what medical supplies he had: whiskey for disinfectant, clean cloth for bandages, herbs that an old native woman had taught him about years ago. The night that followed was one of the longest Ezekiel could remember. He set the woman's leg as best he could, cleaned and bound her wounds, and forced some medicinal tea between her lips. The children watched everything with those enormous, frightened eyes, saying nothing. When he finally had a moment, he heated up a pot of venison stew. Simple fare, just meat and wild onions and herbs, but probably the first real food these children had seen in days. "Eat slow," he warned them as he ladled out portions. "Your bellies ain't used to proper food. Eat too fast and you'll just bring it back up." They tried to obey, but their hunger was too great. Thomas managed to pace himself, but both girls ate too quickly and promptly vomited. Ezekiel cleaned up the mess without comment and gave them smaller portions, making them take tiny bites and wait between each one. Gradually, their bodies accepted the nourishment. As the night wore on and warmth and food began to revive them, the children's fear slowly transformed into exhaustion. One by one, they fell asleep huddled together on a pile of furs near the fire. Ezekiel sat in his chair, rifle across his lap, watching over them and their unconscious mother, wondering what in God's name he had gotten himself into. The woman, he later learned her name was Sarah Brennan, remained unconscious for 3 days. During that time, Ezekiel found himself thrust into the unfamiliar role of caretaker for 3 young children. It was awkward and strange, and he had no idea what he was doing. The children remained wary of him, speaking only when spoken to, flinching at sudden movements. On the 3rd day, when Sarah finally opened her eyes, her first act was to look around frantically for her children. "Thomas? Mary? Elizabeth?" "They're fine, ma'am," Ezekiel said from his seat by the fire where he'd been repairing a trap. "They're out in the yard." "Well, the 2 girls are. Boys helping me with chores." Sarah tried to sit up and immediately gasped in pain, her face going white. Ezekiel moved to her side. "Easy now. Your legs broke bad. Gonna be a while before you're walking again." Tears streamed down Sarah's face, but whether from pain, relief, or something else entirely, Ezekiel couldn't tell. "How long have we been here?" "3 days. You been out cold most of that time." "You saved us," she whispered. "Thomas told me. He said you found us in the forest. That we would have died." Ezekiel shrugged uncomfortably. "Weren't nothing. Any decent person would have done the same." "No," Sarah said firmly, despite her weakness. "Not everyone. We met others on the road. They took what little we had. They would have taken more if I hadn't run." She closed her eyes. "My husband. He died 6 months ago. Cholera. We were trying to reach my sister in Oregon Territory. But our wagon broke down, and the wagon train left us behind. Then those men came." "Don't matter now," Ezekiel said, cutting her off. He didn't want to hear the story, didn't want to know the details that would make these people real to him, that would create obligations and connections. "You're safe here. Once you're healed up and the spring comes, I'll guide you down to the nearest trading post. They can help you get wherever you need to go." But things, as they so often do, didn't work out according to plan. Winter that year was particularly brutal, with storms that lasted days and snowdrifts that reached the cabin's roof. Sarah's leg healed slowly, complicated by the infection that kept trying to reassert itself. And the children, despite their initial fear, began to thaw in the warmth and safety of the cabin. Thomas followed Ezekiel everywhere, eager to learn the skills of mountain survival. Mary and Elizabeth, once they realized the big bearded man wasn't going to hurt them, began to chatter like birds, their voices filling the cabin with a sound it hadn't heard in 15 years. Laughter. They asked endless questions, told elaborate stories, and somehow wormed their way past every defense Ezekiel had carefully constructed. One evening, about 6 weeks after he'd found them, Elizabeth climbed into his lap as he sat by the fire. She was the bolder of the two girls, with a gap-toothed smile and an infectious giggle. She looked up at him seriously and said, "Mr. Thornton, are you going to be our new papa?" Ezekiel felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart. He looked at Sarah, who was watching from the bed with an unreadable expression. He looked at Thomas, who was pretending to be focused on the piece of wood he was carving. He looked at Mary, who had stopped mid-movement to stare at her sister with wide eyes. "No, little one," he said gently, his voice rough with emotion he'd thought long dead. "I ain't your papa. Your papa is watching over you from heaven, and I'm sure he was a good man. But you take care of us," Elizabeth persisted with the relentless logic of childhood. "You feed us and keep us warm and teach Tommy things. That's what papas do." Ezekiel had no answer for that. He simply held the little girl as she fell asleep in his arms, and stared into the fire, and wondered when exactly these 4 strangers had become people he couldn't imagine letting go. Spring came eventually, as it always does. Sarah's leg healed, though she walked with a limp. The day came when Ezekiel knew he could no longer delay. He needed to guide them to civilization, to get them back to the world of other people where they belonged. He began preparing for the journey, gathering supplies, checking his traps one last time. But on the night before they were set to leave, as the children slept and Sarah sat mending clothes by the fire, she spoke quietly. "What if we didn't go?" Ezekiel looked up from cleaning his rifle. "Mum, what if we stayed? Here, I mean, with you?" She met his eyes. "I know it's not proper. I know people would talk. But out here, there are no people. Just us. And the children. They're happy here. Thomas worships you. The girls have finally stopped having nightmares. And I." She paused. "I feel safe for the first time in a long time." Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment. He thought about the silence of the last 15 years, the isolation he'd chosen, the grief he'd wrapped around himself like a shroud. He thought about little Elizabeth, asking if he'd be their papa. He thought about Thomas's pride when he'd successfully skinned his first rabbit. He thought about Mary's terrible singing and Sarah's quiet strength. "It'd be a hard life," he finally said. "Harder than you know. Winters are brutal. We'd be alone, maybe months at a time." "We're already alone," Sarah said. "But here with you. We wouldn't be lonely. And so they stayed. The mountain man who had run from the world found himself building a larger cabin to accommodate his unexpected family. The woman who had lost everything found herself building a new life in the wilderness. And 3 starving children who had once begged a stranger not to kill them found a home in the mountains, with a papa who taught them to be strong, and to be kind, and to never give up hope even in the darkest winter. Years later, when traders would occasionally pass through, they would speak with wonder of the strange family in the high valley. The massive bearded man with the gentle hands, his limping wife with her iron will, and their 3 grown children who moved through the wilderness like ghosts. And if anyone asked about how such an unlikely family came to be, the answer was always the same. Sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms, wearing furs and carrying a lantern through the snow.